In the history of World War II, names like Tiger and Panther get all the glory, but there was one low-slung, turretless machine that did more of the heavy lifting than any other. It was invisible in the tall grass, silent until it struck, and deadly efficient. This was the StuG III. It wasn't designed to be a tank killer, but it became the most successful armored vehicle in the German arsenal, racking up more confirmed kills than any of its legendary cousins. Today, we are looking at the workhorse of the front, the machine that proved you don't need a rotating turret to become the ultimate predator of the battlefield. The origin of the Sturmgeschütz III, or StuG III, was not born from a desire for a new tank, but from a desperate cry for help from the German infantry. During the early Blitzkrieg years, the foot soldiers realized they needed mobile, armored artillery that could stay right beside them in the mud and fire directly into enemy bunkers and machine gun nests. General Erich von Manstein envisioned a machine that was low to the ground, heavily armored at the front, and built on a reliable tank chassis. This led to the birth of the Sturmgeschütz, a specialized assault gun designed to be the infantry's best friend and the enemy's worst nightmare. Engineering the StuG III was a masterclass in pragmatic design. Instead of building a complex and expensive rotating turret, the engineers at Daimler-Benz took the reliable chassis of the Panzer III and mounted a fixed armored casemate directly on top. This allowed for a much lower profile, standing only about 2 meters tall, making it incredibly easy to hide in the folds of the terrain. By removing the turret, they could also fit thicker frontal armor and a larger gun than a standard Panzer III could ever carry. It was a simple, rugged, and lethal solution that would prove to be one of the most cost-effective decisions in military history. The initial versions, the OSF A through E, were armed with a short-barreled 75mm KWK-37 gun, nicknamed the Stump. Its primary mission was high-explosive support. It would crawl alongside the infantry, using its low silhouette to avoid detection, and then obliterate fortifications with a single, precise shot. At this stage, the StuG wasn't meant to fight other tanks, it was a moving bunker buster. However, the crews soon discovered that even with a short gun, the StuG's heavy front armor made it a tough opponent in an accidental encounter with enemy armor, setting the stage for its eventual evolution. One of the greatest advantages of the StuG III was its industrial efficiency. Because it lacked the complex gears and motors of a rotating turret, it was much faster and cheaper to produce than a standard tank. While the German factories struggled to build enough Panthers and Tigers, they could pump out StuGs by the thousands. It used 20% less steel and required significantly fewer man-hours to assemble. This meant that even as Germany's resources began to dry up, the StuG III remained in mass production, eventually becoming the most produced German armored fighting vehicle of the entire war. To move this low-slung beast, the Germans relied on the proven Maybach HL-120 engine. Because the StuG lacked the weight of a heavy turret, it was remarkably reliable and agile for its time. It could navigate through narrow village streets and thick forests where larger tanks would get stuck. The suspension was robust and easy to maintain, a far cry from the mechanical nightmares found in the Tiger units. For the German High Command, the StuG was the perfect gap filler, a reliable, affordable, and deadly machine that could be deployed to any sector of the front on short notice. Life inside the StuG was incredibly cramped but tactically superior in many ways. The four-man crew, commander, gunner, loader, and driver, lived in a world of hot steel and oily fumes, but they were protected by a 50mm, and later 80mm, frontal plate that was nearly impenetrable to light anti-tank fire. The low ceiling meant that every movement had to be calculated, but the tight-knit nature of the crew often led to superior coordination. The StuG wasn't just a vehicle, it was a mobile fortress where the crew and the machine worked in perfect, lethal harmony to provide the wall of fire the infantry so desperately needed. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 was the moment the StuG III had to grow up or die. Confronted by the thick armor of the T-34 and KV-1, the short-barreled Stump was suddenly outclassed. The German infantry were being crushed by Soviet steel, and the StuG was forced into a role it was never designed for, tank-to-tank combat. This led to the creation of the OSF F and the legendary OSF G, fitted with the long-barreled 75mm StuK-40 gun. This upgrade transformed the humble assault gun into one of the most effective tank killers in history, capable of punching through Soviet armor from over a kilometer away. The low profile of the StuG III was its greatest weapon in the vast, open steppes of Russia. While a Tiger or Panther stood out like a sore thumb on the horizon, a StuG could hide in a shallow ditch or behind a small bush, invisible to Soviet tank commanders until it fired. This led to the development of ambush tactics that became the hallmark of StuG units. They would wait in total silence, let the Soviet columns pass, and then pick them off one by one from the side or rear. It was a cold, calculating form of warfare that earned the StuG a reputation as a ghost that haunted the Soviet armored divisions. The statistical success of the StuG III on the Eastern Front is staggering. By early 1944, StuG units had claimed over 20,000 confirmed tank kills. Despite having no turret, the StuG proved that a well-trained crew could turn the entire vehicle to aim faster than many tanks could rotate their turrets. This was especially true in defensive actions, where the StuG would sit in a hull-down position, presenting only a tiny, heavily armored target to the enemy. Soviet tankers often complained that they couldn't even see what was hitting them until half their company was already on fire. However, the lack of a turret was also a fatal weakness in close-quarters combat. If a Soviet tank or infantry team managed to get to the side or rear of a StuG, the crew was practically helpless. They had to rotate the entire 23-ton vehicle just to aim at a new threat. This forced the StuG to rely heavily on the very infantry it was designed to protect. The bond of steel between the StuG crews and the foot soldiers was legendary. The infantry would protect the StuG's flanks from tank hunters with grenades, while the StuG would provide the heavy fire needed to break the Soviet charge. As the war progressed, the Germans began to add Schurzhen or armored side skirts to the StuG III to protect against the increasing number of Soviet anti-tank rifles. These plates gave the StuG a wider, more menacing appearance and proved highly effective at pre-detonating anti-tank shells. Additionally, many StuGs were coated in Simmerit, a pasty anti-magnetic paste designed to prevent Soviet soldiers from sticking magnetic mines to the hull. These modifications made the StuG look like a battle-scarred veteran, a machine that had survived the worst the Eastern Front could throw at it and kept on fighting. By 1943, the StuG III had become so successful that the German army began to prioritize its production over traditional tanks. It was the only machine that could be produced in enough numbers to keep the Eastern Front from collapsing. Every German general wanted more StuG battalions, as they were the most reliable fire brigades available. Whether it was holding a bridgehead at Stalingrad or covering the retreat from the Dnieper, the StuG III was the iron spine of the Wehrmacht, a machine that did the dirty work of war without the ego or the fame of the heavy Tiger units. When the Western Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944, they expected to fight a war of movement against German panzers, but they quickly found themselves in a terrifying game of hide-and-seek with the StuG III. In the dense, claustrophobic landscape of the French bocage, the StuG was in its element. Its low profile allowed it to disappear into the thick hedgerows and stone walls of Norman villages. An American Sherman column could be driving down a peaceful country road, only to have the lead tank erupt in flames from a StuG hidden in a barn or a ditch just yards away. The Allies soon realized that the tank without a turret was actually the most dangerous ambush predator in France. The StuG III's lack of a turret, which was a disadvantage in open plains, became a strange benefit in the narrow lanes of Europe. Because the gun was mounted low in the hull, the StuG could fire from positions that would leave a traditional tank exposed. It was also much easier to camouflage with branches and netting, often becoming completely invisible to Allied spotter planes. This forced the British and Americans to move with extreme caution, as every bush or ruined house could hide a lethal 75mm gun. The StuG was the primary reason why the Allied advance through the hedgerow hell of Normandy was measured in yards rather than miles, as each field had to be cleared of these hidden killers. In the rugged, mountainous terrain of Italy, the StuG III proved even more indispensable. The steep, winding roads and narrow bridges of the Apennines were often impassable for the heavy Tigers and Panthers, but the agile and reliable StuG could climb where others failed. It served as the backbone of the German defensive lines at Monte Cassino and the Gothic Line, acting as mobile pillboxes that could be shifted to wherever the Allied pressure was greatest. The StuG crews in Italy became masters of mountain warfare, using the vertical terrain to fire down on Allied columns and then retreating behind rocky ridges before the heavy Allied artillery could respond. One of the most feared aspects of the StuG III for the Allied infantry was its silence. Unlike the heavy roar of a Tiger's engine that could be heard from miles away, the StuG's Maybach engine was relatively quiet. Combined with its low silhouette, a StuG could often crawl into a firing position under the cover of dusk or morning mist without being detected. This led to the terrifying phenomenon of phantom tanks, where Allied units would take fire from an unknown position and find nothing but empty tracks when they finally charged the location. The StuG was a psychological weapon that kept the Allied soldiers in a state of constant, nerve-wracking tension. To counter the StuG threat, the Allies began to rely heavily on their air power, using Typhoons and P-47s to hunt the lowriders from above. But even from the air, the StuG was a difficult target to spot. German crews became experts in passive defense, staying perfectly still under heavy cover during the day and only moving at night. This forced the Allied tank crews to work in much closer coordination with their infantry, as only a soldier on foot could find and identify a StuG hidden in a basement or a thicket. The infantry support vehicle had come full circle, forcing the enemy to change their entire way of fighting just to survive. Despite the overwhelming material superiority of the Allies, the StuG III units continued to inflict heavy losses until the very end. They were the most cost-effective defensive weapon Germany possessed, trading a cheap, mass-produced chassis for dozens of expensive Allied tanks. Every StuG lost was easily replaced by another from the factories, unlike the elite heavy tanks which were almost impossible to recover. In the final battles for France and Italy, the StuG III earned the respect of its enemies as a professional's weapon, a machine that didn't need flash or fame to get the job done, but instead relied on cold, lethal efficiency and the shadow of the earth. As the war reached the borders of the Reich in 1945, the StuG III was fighting a desperate battle on all fronts. In the ruins of Berlin and the muddy fields of East Prussia, the StuG was often the only armored support left for the retreating German divisions. Because it was so easy to operate, many StuGs were manned by young, inexperienced crews or even Volkssturm units in the final weeks. Yet, even in these conditions, the StuG remained a lethal threat. In the narrow streets of the German capital, the StuG was used to ambush Soviet T-34s at point-blank range, turning the city's rubble into a graveyard of armored vehicles in a final, bloody act of defiance. Interestingly, the success of the StuG III was so great that it was widely used by Germany's allies, most notably Finland. During the 1944 Soviet offensive, Finnish StuG units, nicknamed Sturmi, achieved a legendary kill ratio. A handful of Finnish StuGs destroyed nearly 90 Soviet tanks while losing only a few of their own. This performance proved that the StuG III was a world-class weapon when used by highly trained and motivated crews who understood its defensive strengths. The Finns loved the StuG so much that they kept them in active service and storage for decades after the war, a testament to the machine's enduring reliability and effectiveness. The influence of the StuG III on post-war tank design was profound, though not in the way many expected. The concept of the tank destroyer or assault gun without a turret was adopted by several nations during the Cold War. The Swedish STRV-103, or S-tank, is perhaps the most famous descendant of the StuG philosophy, a turretless, low-profile machine designed entirely for defensive warfare in forests and hills. Even modern tank designs have looked at the StuG's success in stealth and profile management as a way to increase survival on a battlefield filled with high-tech guided missiles. Perhaps the most surprising chapter of the StuG III's history took place in the Middle East. After the war, several surviving StuGs were sold or given to nations like Syria and Egypt. These former Nazi machines were refurbished and put into service, eventually facing off against the newly formed Israeli army in the 1948 and 1967 wars. It was a surreal moment in history to see a StuG III, a veteran of the Eastern Front, fighting in the scorching heat of the Golan Heights against Israeli Super Shermans. It was the final combat roar of a machine that had outlived the empire that created it, proving its lethality across 2 decades and 2 continents. Today, the StuG III is a highly sought-after artifact for military museums and private collectors. Standing next to one, you are struck by just how small and low it really is. It doesn't project the same industrial arrogance as a Tiger, instead, it looks like a rugged, practical tool. It is covered in bolts, stowage boxes, and spare track links, a machine built for a long, dirty war. To see a running StuG III at a show like Bovington's Tank Fest is to see the true workhorse of the Wehrmacht in action, its Maybach engine still purring with the same mechanical logic that kept it fighting from the suburbs of Moscow to the streets of Berlin. In the final analysis, the StuG III was the most important German armored vehicle of World War II. It destroyed more tanks than any other machine, it was cheaper to build, and it was more reliable than the legendary Cats. It proved that you don't need a fancy rotating turret or a 70-ton mass to dominate the battlefield. All you need is a low profile, a powerful gun, and a crew brave enough to wait in the shadows until the enemy is in their sights. The StuG III remains a masterpiece of pragmatic engineering, a silent, lethal reminder that in war, the most dangerous enemy is the one you never see coming.